Hello and welcome to The Appetite, a podcast all about food, body, sport, and mental health. Brought to you by Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment program in Seattle, Washington. This podcast is all about bringing the themes of our work as clinicians into a wider conversation. I'm your host, Carter Umhau, a therapist, artist, and writer. Today, we've got Opal co-founder and psychologist Lexi Giblin to join me and talk about facing fears. So today, Lexi and I are here talking about facing fears.
Yes.
Which is a group at Opal.
Yes.
But it's also a bit of a philosophy to live by, too.
True that. So I'm Lexi Giblin and have been running the Facing Fears group at Opal since we opened and have major passion about facing fears in general in life, both because witnessing it in clients and what it does, but also in my personal life. It's been a real North Star, I would say. My life would be very different right now if I didn't face fears regularly, right?
So with facing fears at Opal, I think probably maybe some people can imagine exactly what that is, and I would imagine most people can't. So I would love to just start with getting a little bit of perspective and context around why that group is part of Opal, and then why we would be talking about it for everyone else and for ourselves too.
Well, it was born out of this, just noticing how much avoidance was happening, and how much anxiety was guiding decision making. And so one of our ways of thinking in the group is, to make decisions based on our values versus our fears, letting fear take a backseat to what we're really wanting in our life. Because of course, so often we most want what we most fear. And it's tough because of course, anxiety tells you to avoid the feared experience, right? So when you're facing fears, you have to go opposite to what your anxiety is telling you. So focusing on our decisions based on our values. And then also in that group, we're working on what we would call exposure therapy, which is confronting anxiety. So creating situations that typically bring up anxiety in order to have a different experience with the feared stimulus or experience. So in exposure therapy, the feared experience or stimuli is paired with safety. And so over repeated exposures to that fear, the safety starts to get blended with the feeling of fear. And so safety starts to penetrate as we do more and more exposures. So we're doing some exposure therapy in there. And one of the ways we also talk about it is we think of our comfort zone in life as a confining box. And then what we do in facing fears is step outside of that comfort zone box and into where the magic happens, where vitality lives. Because we can probably all relate to this feeling that you get when you move towards anxiety. You can feel really alive, especially if it goes, in the way that you had hoped. This incredible vitality can be found because you're often just stepping right into what you care most about.
That feels really resonant to me in some ways. And I also have had the experience of very much not being in touch with what I actually want out of a situation and just knowing that I feel anxious and scared and maybe should try it anyway.
Yeah.
And it can be rewarding, but I definitely know that I grow, whatever it is. At least I've gotten rid of the fear a little bit.
Right. So you might just say, I just am going to step into this and see what happens. So the what's going to happen next is unknown. You might not have an expectation, just want to see what happens. Some hypothesis testing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with eating disorders, we've certainly talked on the podcast quite a bit about the over-controlled temperament. And it's easy for me to imagine and to know, too, out of experience, of course, that the eating disorder client often does have an over-controlled temperament. And so leaning into anxiety and leaning into a place of risk-taking is not going to be natural. How would you explain some of the bigger picture benefits of that?
Right. So risk aversion or risk threat sensitivity is one of the prominent characteristics of the over-controlled individual. So in the case of the over-controlled temperament, the person may experience neutral stimuli as threatening. So that means they're getting lots of false positives, right? So lots of information that's telling them that this is to be avoided, when actually it's quite safe. So you can think about, I mean, I think we all can identify with places in our lives where our anxiety is there, but there's something that we may desperately want or need in our lives, and the anxiety is telling us to avoid it. And with our clients at Opal, the feared stimuli or the feared experience is food often.
Mm.
So we're watching folks approach the feared stimuli, meal after meal, and helping them learn to experience the safety that can be found while experiencing food, which is a tall task. I mean, every day at Opal, it's just, you just watch the bravery because the anxiety is so strong. They're facing a fear every meal often.
Mm.
And keeping on with it. It's a beautiful thing to behold, which also gets me to another idea that we certainly work with in facing fears at Opal, and I found to be so true in my life, is the facing fears together.
Hmm.
When you share the experience of facing fears, maybe you have a friend that you're both doing something that's scary together. It's so powerful to have the connectedness within the facing of the fears. So we often think about the relational impact of facing fears together at Opal and beyond.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the example of even doing some sort of like risky type adventure
Mm.
sport. I don't know why I think of that with facing fears. Maybe it's fear factor or something, but like that you would be bungee jumping, but doing that, actually holding someone's hand, the clarity and the calm that might be able to come from like, okay, we're in this together, and then the bond afterward
Right.
to reinforce that went well. We're good.
Yeah.
That was so fun.
And we inspire each other. I mean, that's one of the things that, it's so great to be in Facing Fears on Friday mornings. I go in super anxious. Every Friday morning, I'm a little anxious. We do the thing that we've decided to do. And then on the other side of that experience, I feel connected to folks in the room and feel inspired often. Like, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. I've got to do this thing that I'm scared of in my life, and they're doing it in all these kinds of ways. It's quite inspirational.
Can you tell me more specifically about what different tasks you guys would do in there? I've been in there before, full disclosure, but I guess
Yeah.
for our audience, can you tell a little bit
Yeah.
more about what happens?
Yeah. Well, we set up all situations that tend to create anxiety in most people. So we have probably 15 different feared activities that we do, including karaoke and open mic and eye contact. We have a just do it day where we just go for whatever we've been avoiding, the emails, the voicemails, the applying to school, looking for a job, whatever it is, the just do it hour. And we all get together and say, we're going to, this is what I'm going to do. And then everyone helps each other as they do the feared activity. We do retail therapy. Also, we go out shopping. And that is often quite anxiety provoking for folks who are recovering from an eating disorder. So that is just a number of different experiences.
Mm.
There's a quote that I wrote down that I love that kind of highlights what we're talking about. And this is from Marianne Williamson. She writes, "As we let our own lights shine, we unconsciously give people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others."
Mm.
That is much of what we experience in facing fears, and also, just in our friendships. A lot of times we'll see a friend doing something and, wow, I can do that. The possibility is more present in my mind by seeing you do that.
And that makes me think of an example that maybe I've referenced on here before of choosing to do an improv class when I was younger.
Yes.
And I remember very much talking to my best friend, Sarah, on her bed when we were like 18, 19 years old. I remember it very vividly because I was freaked out. She was describing an improv class. She's an actress, and she was describing some introductory exercise they were doing, and my eyes were just wide. Like, there is not a chance in hell I would ever, ever, ever do that. I would die of humiliation. And she just sort of looked at me, and I thought, okay, yeah, you're right. I need to sign up. And so that was the impetus, just like to notice that I was scared out of my mind. Even imagining it, I felt scared that it must be something that I needed to move toward.
Uh-huh.
And she's an incredibly inspiring person. I think that there wouldn't have been even an access for me to imagine what it would be like to do something so new without having been inspired by her, for
Right.
sure. And it wound up being transformative in terms of the amount of self-consciousness that I moved through just by showing up to do that weekly for 6 weeks or whatever it was.
Wow. I love how the friendship plays such a strong role in that.
Mhm. So in my example, I certainly noticing the amount of physical anxiety and nausea I felt around improv was an indicator that I needed to face a fear. But I'm curious what you think in terms of what other things can often be indicators for a fear that's there.
Well, I think when we have a strong emotion about something that could signal that there's something there, there's something meaningful there, or you wouldn't care about it,
Mhm.
right? And sometimes, of course, we feel anxious because it's smart to avoid the situation. But sometimes we feel anxiety that's telling us that there's something important to be learned in this approach of this experience.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
living in fear of an experience for your life is, if you've always know that there's a monster on the other side of the wall, you're going to maybe live differently and make choices based on avoidance of the monster,
Yeah.
and that may limit yourself and you won't have as much freedom in your decision making, perhaps because you are aware of the monster and you're making decisions to avoid the monster.
Mm.
But the monster, maybe I shouldn't use monster. But what I would want to emphasize as well is the learning that takes place when we do something we don't typically do, when we step outside of our comfort zone and into the magic, where the magic happens. You will experience new stimuli, and that stimuli creates new learning. So if we did the same thing every day in, day out, we wouldn't have access to the same learning situations as we would if we do step into our anxiety and take risks.
Mm.
So the learning is really important in all of this too.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You have described many times the amount of fear you felt in opening Opal to begin with.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to hear about what that
Hmm.
yeah, what kind of monsters were there at that moment in your life?
Yeah, so that was definitely maybe my biggest facing fear of my life, or certainly my career.
Mhm.
And I was in it with Julie and Kara, so that makes it feel really different. But Julie, Kara, and I were all also taking risks in our relationships, because how were we going to do working together? Was this wise for us to be in business with each other? What is this going to do with for our relationships? And there's a lot of risk in that. And then also, I mean, what we did to make Opal happen involved incredible risk that I just can't even believe that we took when I look back on it. As we took out an SBA loan, we put our savings in a pot, and we signed a 10-year lease on 5,000-6,000 square feet. And we had a bunch of credit cards with 0% financing if you could pay it off within a year.
Whew.
And so we racked up all kinds of debt on our credit cards, our personal credit cards, in order to launch Opal. And of course, we didn't know what would happen. It was a tremendous risk, certainly financially, but beyond that, it was, career risk in a major way, and all the emotions that come with that. So before jumping, boy, we really were sitting with a lot of anxiety. And I never felt so incredibly vital in my work.
Mm.
I mean, the amount of energy I had during the launch phase and beforehand, it was like I couldn't stop doing the Opal work, because I was just completely gripped and excited, and had this incredible surge of vitality, and just it was an amazing time. And it kind of has this feeling of like, I want to do that again. I want to do
Yeah.
that again.
What did your life look like during that time? Like, were you or even leading up to it, were you working on other things? Still seeing clients and
Yeah.
then moving into it, or
I was working private practice, and I was teaching at the UW, And I left the UW, which was my home for, I think I'd been there for 15 years with graduate school and then teaching for 7 or 8 years. And so I left UW, and that felt like facing fear to leave what felt like my home to launch Opal. So I stopped doing teaching to work on Opal, but then I kept my private practice going. And I was a mom to a younger child at that time. So that was a really intense phase, really, really incredible, though. I just think of it as warm and fuzzies, when I think back. But that's because
Yeah.
everything turned out. Um,
Yeah, that 10-year
yeah.
lease has been filled with actual people in the building.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, the risk was very much worth it in hindsight.
So you said earlier when you were talking about the philosophy behind facing fears that it's often pointing us towards something that we want desperately or that we desire. I'm so curious about that in this story of opening Opal because you clearly felt so at home at UW and you clearly were so invested in your private practice. Was there sort of a seed that started growing around like, oh, I could do this or what was that?
Yeah.
What was that about?
Well, maybe I'd go back and share another big moment in my life related to your question, which was, in graduate school, I had, I think, diagnosable public speaking phobia.
Mm.
And I can remember going into my dissertation and the incredible, almost near panic I was in to go and present. And I went through graduate school in this really heightened state of anxiety because there's a lot of speaking publicly.
Yeah, and you're saying that on a podcast now.
And here I am on a podcast.
Yeah.
So
okay.
then when I graduated, I was offered a position as a lecturer at the UW.
How ironic.
I know. And and this meant getting up in front of 200 students 4 days a week for an hour. I remember feeling so incredibly scared. And, just if I would have followed my anxiety, clearly I would have said no to the opportunity. But then at the same time, I felt like there's something in this. I do enjoy teaching. If it weren't for the anxiety, I would love to do that job and love working with college students and love the subject of abnormal psychology. And so I decided to go for it. And so over the course of 7 years of teaching, my anxiety eventually became manageable. And it's really what I think allowed me space to consider doing something like Opal. I don't think I would have ever jumped from public speaking phobia to Opal, right? So there was this bridge that I used to get to a place where that felt capable of facing this yet another fear and living into something that I cared deeply about and not letting fear dictate my decisions. So then I was teaching. I think that brought me confidence about it. And then, I think Julie, Kara, and I, when we were in conversations about Opal, the three of us all just felt such excitement about it. And the feeling of creating something, taking risks with others is something that I seek out in different ways because of how incredible the experience has been. Like just to join with others and creating something that you are all passionate about and going for it and share the risk. You're kind of sharing the risk more. You wouldn't be alone in the loss.
Yeah, it sounds so much more fun too.
So
Just
much more
simply,
fun. Right. Yeah.
Simply more fun in a
Right.
way to get to actually be able to bounce those things off of other people and share the excitement and share the thrill and share the process.
So I say without facing fears, I would have a different life. Certainly I wouldn't be talking on this podcast right now. Yeah.
I was thinking earlier about how the idea of noticing like where you feel desire, that can be an indicator of where there might also be fear attached to it. And also feeling fear can be a sign that there's some desire that kind of works both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that for myself, there have been times in my life that I'm really clued into desire and I'm very much like, I want to do that and I want to try this and I want to take this risk or even like I feel scared and I need to grow and I'm like desperate to grow because this isn't working. But the in between of feeling sort of apathetic or comfortable or just ambivalent it's a lot harder for me to tap into either fear or desire. And I think especially for people that are, in a comfortable life already or doing something that they care about enough for, whatever, that noticing an opportunity to face a fear, I think could be difficult.
Mhm.
If that seed hasn't even been it isn't recognizable. I was gonna say the seed hadn't been planted, but I kind of trust that most people have some seeds of desire planted,
Yeah.
but they might be hidden a little bit.
Yeah. I love the way of thinking about it as desire.
Mhm.
Using that language is opens it up.
Yeah.
No.
I really wanna write a book one day.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have said that on the podcast, but I do,
Whoa.
I do, I do. I do, and I was at Elliott Bay Bookstore last night, and I was just wandering around, and it's sort of a dangerous place for me to go in when you wanna write a book and you're surrounded by books and you haven't even started.
Mm.
It sort of feels like both, you've walked into a gold mine and also you've walked into hell a little bit, like, all of these people have done this and I haven't, So
Yeah.
I was looking at all the books and normally I go, "Oh, I wish I had written that. Oh, it'd be so fun to write something like that. Oh, I really like that." And then I get all upset. And yesterday I was just like, screw it. Like I'm not gonna pick up a single book. I'm sitting down right here in this chair and I'm gonna start writing. So I did that for 5 minutes and left not feeling nauseated. But it was a place where the fear of not doing it was able to be like an action step rather than suppressed desire in some way or
So would you say you're more in a stuck place with it, in a place of comfort and not wanting to step into discomfort of writing?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels hard to I noticed that there's a lot of desire, and then that feels scary. Like,
Yeah.
the risk-taking of actually being like, "Well, that would matter a lot to me, I would like that."
Mm.
Is difficult to
Yeah.
even tolerate. It's not that I feel like, "Oh, I'm so scared that I would fail," but just even scared of the feeling of desire itself
Mm.
sometimes.
Yeah. Claiming your desire.
Mhm.
And I love that you just claimed it on the
I
podcast.
know, what a regret I'm already having.
We all know now. So
Uh-oh.
then there's this now we have this social connection to you. This, I'll
Yep.
probably nudge you about that
God.
moving forward.
Yeah. Feels sick. No.
But I think
Thank you.
something else, that I would say is when we think about the stages of change, usually we are in a place of cognitive dissonance, or there's an angsty part of us that maybe part of us that feels that desire and that feels the anxiety of avoiding it. And you're just feeling this emotion and discomfort. And that is a motivating emotion to have.
Mhm.
It sounds like you were in maybe a dissonant place with writing when you were
Yeah.
in the bookstore.
Yeah. That idea of dissonance, I think, is significant
Mhm.
to that point around, what if you're not feeling something really large? Because I
Right.
would imagine if you're feeling a lot of dissonance a lot, then maybe you start numbing out. Like, it's just kind of an overwhelm
Mhm.
state that could happen
Mhm.
to be in conflict with yourself in some ways. And that makes me just curious even about our clients again
Yeah.
around a numbing out that happens eventually if
Right.
there's too much conflicting feeling.
Yeah, that word, you used the word comfortable earlier. Yeah,
Mhm.
and if you're not usually comfortable if you're feeling dissonance.
Mhm.
And you can bring about dissonance in different ways. But I also think life just has a way of sending us challenges and
Mhm.
dissonance.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Another way of thinking about this, a lot of our culture thinks about approaching anxiety. The idea is more to decrease anxiety,
Mhm.
to increase comfort, decrease anxiety. And when we're facing fears, of course, we're coming from a different paradigm where we're saying facing anxiety is where it's at. So it's a different way of thinking, right? This is choosing to be uncomfortable. And that is not necessarily the way our culture thinks about emotions. Moving towards difficult emotions is foreign to lots of folks. And we think about it as good therapy hurts.
Mhm.
Usually when you're changing, it's uncomfortable. When you're
Mm.
learning, sometimes it can be uncomfortable. When you're doing good therapy, it can be hurtful. It can be painful.
Mm.
But it's a sign that growth is happening and you're taking in new experiences.
So if there was some sort of cultural shift even around risk and growth being more of a value than comfort, I can only imagine what things would shift.
Yeah. Also, to think about how perfectionism plays a role
Yeah.
in facing fears, because a lot of times we'll not want to do something because we're not expert at it yet. And of course, when we start something, anything new, we're just not going to be good at it. And you're not going to be perfect at it. But perfectionism can often be a reason to not do the thing that scares you because you're just going to be floundering probably. If you've never done it before, you don't know what's what. It's going to be messy until you reach that place of expertise. It's going to be a while, and to tolerate all of the imperfection of approaching it is it's really uncomfortable.
So when you were starting Opal, back to that example, was
Yeah.
there like how did you tolerate the mess of that? I would imagine a lot of stuff that you were doing was not stuff that you had done before.
No, yeah, the learning curves were steep in all directions. I'd learned commercial real estate and,
Whoa.
all these different domains that I didn't study, in school. And the learning curve was really steep. And the anxiety and dealing with perfectionism was part of that for sure, because it just was not going to be perfect. And it was messy all the time. And mistakes were made constantly. And that's probably why we have the value wabi sabi, which is where we celebrate imperfection and the beauty in imperfection. I think that a lot of those values are born out of Julie, Kara, and I's experiences. But perfectionism, it would not, if I was to be perfect, try to be perfect and have to have that standard for myself, there's no way. I mean, every day it's a new mistake or a new learning of something that we need to do differently. So it's just making that assumption that that's going to happen most days in some way or another.
So starting something off with the assumption that it's maybe not going to go so well, but it's still important is
Right.
part of dealing with the perfectionism.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Is that kind of values oriented thinking one of the main ways that you would say is kind of the way that you would walk through dealing with perfectionism?
I do personally. I think about what is this? What's the purpose of my life? What's the meaning? And you can tolerate a lot when you're doing something you really care about.
Mm.
When you are really engaged and feeling vital about something, you can tolerate all kinds of difficult emotions because it's deeply meaningful to you, and it's existentially, it's tapping something in you that matters. And it overrides. I found it. Oh, it tends to override. The discomfort that comes with it.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to Jack Straw Cultural Center for sound engineering, to Aaron Davidson for the Appetite's original music, and to Sarah Taylor for production assistance and editing. Stay in touch with what's new on The Appetite by subscribing to the podcast on your preferred podcast app. If you have the time, we also love getting reviews of the podcast. So write a little something or another to us and let us know how you're liking it. If you have any questions or just want to connect, email us at theappetite@opalfoodandbody.com. If you or someone you know is struggling, please feel free to check out our treatment options at opalfoodandbody.com. It's also a place that you can just get a little bit more of a sense of our culture. To stay in touch otherwise, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Talk to you next time.